What's going on, Alex Bros? It's Mr. C here, and in this video, I'm going to discuss the imaginary unit and powers of I. So let's go ahead and start with the imaginary unit, the definition of it. The imaginary unit is a number, quote, number, I, such that I squared is equal to -1. Now, why would something like this be important or even necessary? Well, a long time ago, math people thought they had all the quadratic equations figured out in terms of solving them, so on and so forth, until, they came across something such as this. Solve x squared plus 25 is equal to 0. And one way of going about doing that is to maybe move the 25 over to the right-hand side, in which case you get x squared is equal to -25. Now, before the invention of the imaginary unit, this was unsolvable in the sense that, there's no real number that's going to be squared and give us a negative number. So in other words, they were
denied.
Anyhow, so think about it. If you take a positive number and you square it, you're going to get a positive number returned. If you get a negative number and square it, you're going to get a positive number in return. So there's no real number that solves this sort of equation. So somebody thought, well, you know what? If we can create another number, another type of number, in this case an imaginary unit, and we'll see in another video complex number, then we have a way of solving for x. Okay, so with the definition of the imaginary unit, I'm going to give you a rewrite of it. To say that I squared is equal to -1 is to say that the square root of -1 is equal to I. Now, what's neat about having the rewrite this way is that we can introduce something called the principal square root of -n property. In other words, having these versions of I, in particular, the square root of -1 version of I versus the square of I, if we come across the square root of a negative number, such as the square root of -n to be generic, we're allowed to imagine taking out the negative and rewriting that. We could rewrite that square root as the square root of n with I directly on the outside of it. Now, the placement of I, you could have it to the right of the square root of n or in front of the square root of n. But the overall idea here is that when you square root a negative number, there's actually the imaginary unit involved. I like to say that if I see the square root of a negative number, that I get so angry that I pull an eye out. But not literally, of course, because I only have 2 tries at that. So, long story short, the square root of a negative number winds up being the square root of the positive version of the number with I on the outside of the square root. So for example, if we wanted to simplify something like the square root of -13, there's a negative sign in there, so I is involved, and we're going to go ahead and write it out explicitly. Basically pull it out, write an I directly to the right of the square root. The square root of -13 can be rewritten as the square root of 13I. Now, some authors like to put the I in front of the square root so that it doesn't look like it's inside the square root. So another way of writing this answer is I times the square root of 13. Something interesting that I wanted to include in this video and in the notes are some different powers of I. We know that I to the first, of course, is going to be I, but is also equal to the square root of -1. And we also saw at the very top how we define the imaginary unit. It's such that I squared is equal to -1. So right here it says since I is equal to the square root of -1, we have the following results. I squared is equal to -1. Okay, we saw that at the very top. But now I'd like to look at I cubed. Something interesting about I cubed is that you could rewrite it as I squared times I. Knowing that I squared is equal to -1, this simplifies to -I. I to the fourth is interesting as well. You could write I to the fourth as I squared times I squared, in which case we have negative 1 times negative 1, and we get positive 1 in return. So this is kind of a case where we are raising I to a certain power, and it gives us an ordinary real number, and I squared is a case of that as well. But it turns out that these are the only powers of I, or actually all other powers of I simplify to one of these four results. It's either going to simplify to I, which is the square root of negative 1, or your power of I will simplify to negative 1, negative I, or positive 1. So like for example, if I had I to the 7th, we could write that as I to the 4th times I cubed. I to the 4th is 1, and I cubed is negative I, and so that simplifies to negative I. So I to the 7th is equivalent to I cubed. We won't really need to venture down that route too deeply in this course, but it is worth mentioning. It's kind of interesting, so I wanted to share it with you. All right, and that's where I'm going to end the video. Of course, if you have any questions about what was covered in it, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.